Okay, we will get started. So, good morning and welcome to today's Carer Knowledge Exchange webinar, Empowering First Nations Carer Voices, Transforming Policy and Practice. My name is Sarah Judd-Lamb. I'm the Executive Manager, Policy Development and Research at Carers New South Wales, and I have the privilege of introducing today's session, which we have co-developed closely with our wonderful facilitator and guest speakers who you will meet shortly. The Carers New South Wales CEO, Elena Katrakis, also wanted me to pass on her sincere apologies for being unable to join today's session, where she usually would chair. She's currently at an all-day meeting in Melbourne, and she would have loved to hear the discussion firsthand, but is very keen to watch the recording as soon as it is available. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm joining from today, the land of the Gadigal people and their elders past and present. And I also want to acknowledge the many, many lands from across Australia represented by our panellists and speakers today, and also by our audience. So you're welcome to post in the chat where you are joining from if you'd like to share the lands that you're on today, so we can get a feel for where everybody is joining from today. And it's also really important, given our topic today especially, to acknowledge the significant contribution of First Nations carers to their communities, and to acknowledge that care for First Nations people extends to caring for country and culture. Research tells us that caring is more prevalent and often more complex in First Nations communities, and the ways in which caring responsibilities are prioritised and shared in these communities provide important insights about how we as a nation can do better in supporting all carers. Thankfully, I won't be doing a lot of talking today. I will soon be handing over to our session facilitator, Judith, and to our guest speakers, so we can all learn from their extensive experience and wisdom. But I first want to provide a brief overview of the Carer Knowledge Exchange for those of you that are not familiar with the project that is hosting today's webinar. So the Carer Knowledge Exchange is a knowledge translation project led by Carers New South Wales with funding from the New South Wales Government. We aim to connect research to practice to improve outcomes for carers. And one of the main ways that we do this is through interactive events like today's webinar. I should also note, just for context, that this project defines a carer as any individual who provides care and support to a family member or friend who lives with a disability, mental illness, alcohol or drug dependency, chronic condition, terminal illness, or who is frail due to age. While there is often practical overlap with the foster and kinship care sectors, those sectors are not the focus of today's webinar. Today, we have a slightly different structure to our usual webinars in the Carer Knowledge Exchange to make the most of the wonderful opportunity we have to listen to some of the leading voices in First Nations carer research in Australia. Our guest facilitator, Judith, who I will introduce shortly, will lead an in-depth discussion with our guest speakers for most of the session. And we won't be having breakout room discussions, which we usually would do in these sessions, but there will be an opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A function and through the chat, and to provide your comments and reflections through the chat. And before we get started, we are going to launch a poll. There's 2 questions that should pop up on your screen, so we can just get a bit of a better idea of who's in our audience today. So you should see that popping up before you, and if you could please take a moment to answer both questions. So the first one is asking you to describe your role, and the second question is asking about your background. If you could just take a few moments to answer that, that just gives us a great idea of who's in the audience today, so we can understand, I'm sure, the vast spread of those that are joining us to listen. That's great. I can see those answers coming through. Let's give you a couple more moments to finish that. Wonderful. Excellent. And while everyone finishes that, I will want to mention as well, so we recognise that in these webinars we have a lot of carers and others with lived experience who join us. And so if that is you, and if you hear something that causes you distress or you need to talk to someone, we have a wellbeing officer who's available online in a separate Teams room that you're welcome to contact. And I believe further information about how to do so will be posted in the chat. Great. And then if everyone's done with their polls, we'll just leave that running. I'm now pleased to be able to hand over to our guest facilitator, Judith Lovegrove. So Judith is a Ngarrindjeri woman with broad cultural connections extending across most of South Australia. She has extensive vocational experience working with children, young people, and adults in different capacities, and has held several senior leadership roles in both government and non-government organisations. Over the years, Judith has contributed to many national, state, and local initiatives that work towards closing the gap and largely empowering Aboriginal people and voices, with an emphasis on improving culturally responsive service delivery for organisations and departments. She has a strong passion and commitment for improving mental health and social and emotional wellbeing support services for all vulnerable people, including carers. We are very fortunate to have her with us as our facilitator today. Welcome, Judith, and handing over to you.
Well, good morning, and thank you so much for that lovely warm welcome, Sarah. It is a real honour to be able to facilitate today's session with a really important conversation about how we can empower the voices of our First Nations carers and transforming the sector to improve policy and practice. I'd also like to just acknowledge that we are all linking in from traditional lands, lands and sovereignty that has never been ceded and always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Also want to acknowledge a special acknowledgement to the two phenomenal First Nations women who are on our panel today that will be providing some really important insights around their professional experience as well as lived experience in this space. I just wanted to say how exciting it is to start this conversation and how important it is that we start to get the ball rolling in terms of identifying some of the gaps with the research that each of our panellists have been involved in, as well as trying to really translate some of that into practice for today. And I really want to be able to create an opportunity in this conversation where it is interactive and very rich. And just wanted to put it out there that all of the people that are linked in today, there is the chat box. We will have another Q&A session at the end of it, and we really aim to make sure that we are working towards providing a really rich conversation for you all. I wanted to start actually by just briefly mentioning the people on the panel. As you can see, these beautiful women on the screen. Professor Tricia Nagel, who was actually my manager, phenomenal woman with extensive experience working with First Nations communities. Psychiatrist background, and she will talk a little bit more when I get to introduce her. Jasmine Williams, who is also a very inspiring First Nations woman, very staunch professional and lived experience as a carer, and some really important insights around some of the research that she's been involved in, as well as Zoe Staines, another amazing woman with the University of Queensland, who will be speaking a little bit about a bit of a video that we'll be screening in a moment. So I'll be getting Zoe to talk a little bit about her experience in the Caring About Care project. And we have Banok Rind as well from the Wiani Whangani Institute, who also have really broad experience in terms of policy research and also around honing in this really important conversation for carers. So I wanted to just open it up firstly by providing you an opportunity to be able to watch a video from the Caring About Care project, and then we'll regroup and start to hear from the panellists.
Baju Bujari, Nalawa, Namri Warangari Uranuruku, Nalawaji Nyanga Yago, Warami, Bujari Darabara, Tidrigura, Baju Bujari, Auntie Matilda and Auntie June. I acknowledge your leadership and wisdom which guide us all here today. Transformation begins with care, not only in Greater Sydney, but everywhere. In Greater Sydney, we are doing our best to hold everything together, despite the immense challenges we face. The dual burden of unpaid care work and paid employment is physically and emotionally exhausting. We are undervalued and unsupported by the systems that should be there to help us. What we need is culturally appropriate, trauma-informed services that meet the true needs of our communities. Programs like Tramby's work, including Yanarangami, are already making a significant impact by empowering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women through leadership and education opportunities. Policy reforms must focus on supporting and empowering women in leadership rather than undermining their efforts. By fostering trust and respect, these policies will enable leaders to implement changes that benefit the whole community. Intergenerational knowledge that maintains the balance between our Iora people and Nura country could guide governance and policy decisions to address the pressing issues like poverty, family violence, and mental health crises. Caring for others often means we put our own needs last. To transform systems, we must prioritise the well-being of First Nations women. Initiatives like Yanalangami and Sisters in Spirit create vital spaces for women to connect and heal. Reducing administrative burdens on First Nations-led organisations enables them to be actively involved and focus on the actual services that they're trying to deliver. Sustainable and long-term funding is also essential to ensure that they can provide consistent, culturally grounded care. We must also acknowledge the negative behaviours that too often arise that only serve to divide us. We truly grow through respect, sharing, and cultural exchange. We strengthen our community when we stand strong together. Transformation is through care and how we work together collectively to change the systems. By uplifting each other, we can achieve the change we all seek. Nubajigu towards lateral love. Didjurigura, thank you. Yano.
And what an amazing video there to kick us off in a really important topic. Nubajigal, that is a really special word to me, ending that message on the note of lateral love. I'm very well known in all the communities and the work that I've done promoting lateral love and honouring, rest in peace, Uncle Brian Butler, who talks about lateral violence in communities and healing processes with lateral love, and that's something that I do live my life by. Some really important messages. I do encourage everybody that is linked in to provide comments, reflections of that video. I think it speaks real strong volumes to, some of the transformation that we need to do in the sector and across the systems that we know are still having huge gaps in terms of care. I can speak from my own personal experience with being a carer for my elderly father-in-law and the challenges that faces, that I face as a carer myself, and managing all the multiple responsibilities on top of that. So what a phenomenal video and a great way to start. I'd like to now take this opportunity to introduce the wonderful panel and start a conversation about how they've actually transformed their work in their spaces and hearing from their expert experience around how we can make sure we can make some change. I'll start with Tricia. As I said, Tricia is my manager, a phenomenal woman based in NT, extensive experience. Tricia, can you just jump on and introduce yourself in a few seconds, or let us know who you are?
Yes, I'm happy to do that and very happy to be here. Really honoured to be a part of this panel and to share where I'm from very briefly. Darwin, more than 40 years ago, I came as a young doctor, and I've been a psychiatrist and more recently psychiatry and research. And the most useful and wonderful part of my change in my direction of my career was when I worked with Aboriginal mental health workers, and we decided that we needed to work together to bridge the gap in understanding of mental health and social and emotional well-being, with a particular focus on culturally sensitive care planning and aiming to get better outcomes. So we've been training and testing and developing new tools ever since, working with knowledge holders and elders and workers and a range of people who are both caring for and being the clients in a wellbeing journey.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tricia. And I will move over to Jasmine Williams, a very strong and inspiring woman. Had the privilege of having a one-on-one with her to have a chat about her experience. Now, absolutely in awe of this woman, and lots to share in this space. So Jasmine, can you just sum up, I guess, where you're working, what you're doing, and some of your experience that you bring to this conversation?
Mandangal, thank you, Judith, for those lovely, beautifully kind words. Yuanyari Jasmine, my name is Jasmine. I am a proud Wiradjuri and Wallagaloo Yinna. Songlines are from Cowra. My mob come from Brungle and Orange. I have had a lifelong journey in a caring role, and that became a professional role straight out of high school. I have a background in nursing, justice health and mental health, and currently in the research space with the Girama team and with a few beautiful ladies that are from an all-female First Nations research-led team, which is very rare in this space. So it's an honour and a privilege to be able to hold space and conduct research alongside our people, not on and for.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Well, look forward to drawing on your knowledge and, some of the set questions that we do have, we'll be exploring. So thanks, Jasmine. Next one I want to invite is Zoe Staines. Zoe, can you please tell us a bit about who you are, where you are, and your work in this topic?
Thanks so much, Judith. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on this panel. I feel really, really humbled to be here alongside yourself and such amazing Indigenous women as well. So my background is working in universities in research, but before that working in Indigenous nonprofits, including in remote communities. But the reason I'm here today is I'm speaking on behalf of a really big team. So a team that includes Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers, and where we worked alongside an amazing group of strong Indigenous women led by Auntie June Oscar at when they were at the Human Rights Commission, and now alongside that team at the Wiani Yotangani Institute for First Nations Gender Justice at ANU, one of whom those amazing women is joining us today as well, Banok, and I'm sure that she'll speak about that a bit in a minute. So I'm really here to share any kind of wisdom that I can and elevate the voices of the many amazing women that we spoke to in our research, including Karina, who you heard from earlier on that really wonderful video as well. I should also say I'm joining from the Yagara and Turrbal lands, unceded lands here in Meanjin, sort of sunny Brisbane. But thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Zoe. And just to draw on some of your work and understanding your background, how phenomenal is Auntie June Oscar? I think her legacy that she's left behind with the Wiani Yotangani report and, looking at implementation in all jurisdictions, what a real powerful, exercise it is to carry out and deliver to elevate the voices of not just First Nations people, but women that we know are further marginalised for many reasons. So really excited to have you, Zoe. And finally, I'll leave the loveliest to last. Banok, can you please link in and let us know who you are, what you do, and your connection to the topic today?
Judith, and thanks, Zoe, for that brief introduction. I'm Banok. I'm a Parima Yamaji woman from Midwest WA, so my family's from Mount Magnet and Yalgoo and Kew, all along the areas of Midwest. I grew up on Wajak Noongar Budja, but currently live in Naarm. I've been in Naarm for over 10 years now, so a long time. My background is in nursing. I still practice as a registered nurse to keep my registration, and currently work at Wiani Yotangani Institute with an amazing team under the leadership of June Oscar. But related to this topic of care, I think for me it's a personal experience being a carer for my father and mother as well, but also I think just reflecting on it in all our time and just thinking of how staunch Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women have always been. and how we sustain our families and communities. For me, it's something I've grown up seeing. It's something I've grown up to be now, being that carer for both my father and my mother. And then to be able to work in this space is just very wholesome. And then just reflecting on the work of Wiyani Uthangani. My colleague Jane says it perfectly. We've spent the last 7 years of the Wiyani Uthangani project listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and gender diverse mob the last 7 years, and now being established as an institute since last year, March. We are now in the response phase. So we've spent the last 7 years listening, and now we're in the response phase to embed what we've heard. So yeah, very honoured to be on this panel, and yeah, looking forward to the yarns ahead.
Yeah, look, thank you, sis. And, you know, I think there is a real richness when we've got our vocational experience in this space, but when we've got the lived experience, there's a different kind of resonance and passion for this topic. So really appreciate you know, with your lived experience and what you're bringing to the panel today. Now, I've got a series of questions, and at random, we will go through these questions for everyone to hear and I guess showcase some of your work in a bit more detail. And I'm going to kick off with the first question. I'm going to ask Jasmine if she could be the first person that I can ask this question of. So Jasmine, the question that I want to ask you is, how has your work engaged First Nations carers' voices?
Yeah, thank you, Judith. So currently, I mentioned that I'm currently in the research space. So I am working at the moment currently on a qualitative study titled Our Wisdom, Our Ways, Yinjamara Winangana. So in our Wiradjuri language, that is living respectfully in a world worth living in. So it's about, this study has been, the main focus of it has been capturing the voices of our First Nations females that are currently living on Wiradjuri country. We are focused on the challenges that our First Nations female caregivers face, that are not only trying to manage their own complex and chronic health conditions, but also navigating that through westernised health systems, caring for multiple family members and extended kin at the one time, also trying to navigate through employment, and so multiple roles that and many hats that our First Nations females face. And the reality is that hasn't changed for thousands of years. That's what our women has always done, has been the glue, the backbone to each and every family and community. So we wanted to really highlight that from our women, because they have some really powerful voices and stories to share. And the way that we did that was through something that we've done for thousands of years, and in Western academic terminology, it's their methodology. To us, it's yarning.
That's right. Yeah.
We yarn. That's
Absolutely.
how we've always got things done. That's how we have resolved our conflicts. That's how we have discussed concerns in our communities. We sit down and we have a yarn about it. So it was really special to be able to capture that from the women and be able to have them tell their story and their journey, and what they experienced through navigating through health systems and support systems while they're looking after the ones that they care for. We found through this research that it's very limited, rare to very limited, that research hasn't been conducted by First Nations females or First Nations caregivers on First Nations people. It's always been conducted by non-First Nations people, with the objective of finding a solution to problems. We have always been looked at as a deficit focus. So the aim of this project was to look at us through that strengths-based lens, the perspective of these females, and to gather their recommendations, thoughts and actions on how we could improve not only systems, but the general quality of life and their basic health outcomes by being listened to, by actively being listened to as the experts of the ones that they care for, and being able to tell that story that culture is a huge foundation for who we are as a people, and that we must take that on board and have non-First Nations health professionals and service providers understand that it is a daily huge part of who we are, that spirituality, that connection to our land, our country, our mobs. It's who we are, and it's who we've always been. So we need to be able to create a greater awareness. And what way to better do that than through this research?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I am just, as I said before, very in awe of the work that you do, Jasmine, and your passion that drives you, you know, understanding your story. I might just expand on this topic and go to Tricia. I mean, Tricia, you know, one thing that is really highlighted for me in the work that we do in our team is to focus on a strengths-based approach. Did you just want to reflect on that question again? So the question was, how has your work engaged First Nations voices and carers' voices specifically?
Yes, and thanks so much, Jasmine. Our work has been perhaps about trying to find ways to share those stories and to hear from people how that then reflects in care planning in that setting where you're looking for treatment, and the reflection and similarity what you've just said is very strong. So people tell us that they want to sit face to face, they want to sit down, they want to yarn, they want to tell their story, they want to have the people there that they trust. And when they're telling their story, they want it to be everything with the strengths right up front and with the worries coming through after that. And the strengths are very much about spiritual well-being, about kinship, about cultural connection. And the two themes from the areas that we work, which have been with kidney disease and with mental health, the themes are about communication. Those strategies, including pictures rather than lots of text, including that sense of the people, as I said, and the people that you trust. And then this other theme of connection to family, connection to elders and to healers, and going out bush and people missing that connection as being part of the trouble when you're unwell or when you're caring and you can't connect with country, you can't connect with family, and you're wanting to go back and listen to the seagulls and sit on the beach and go turtle hunting and all of these cultural strengths, sitting and weaving. This is what people say they want to do, and that's what we need to listen to.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, Tricia, I think all of your work and your legacy that you're leaving behind around, particularly the Stay Strong approach, we know it's all been First Nations led and co-designed all the way, and is further being, you know, expanded on, improved and localized for different communities. So understanding, I guess, a real strength in identifying a strengths-based approach, and also seeing culture as being central to making sure that we are engaging First Nations carer voices in this space that's centred around those themes. Now, I might hand it over to Banok. Just a question that I wanted to ask you. In your work, lived experience and work experience, what are some of the common features or experiences among the First Nations carers that your work has actually identified?
Yeah, so Zoe would probably talk more to the Caring About Care report that launched last year, but with the women, Aboriginal women and girls and gender diverse mob that we engaged with over the last 7 years, there are a number of things that came up. So we engaged with communities across the country, from up to the Torres Strait to down to the southwest to WA to remote communities. June is from Fitzroy Crossing, so she is from a remote community. She lives in a remote community, so making sure that we captured the voices of women and girls from these communities was really important, to make sure that it was really well informed and everybody felt heard, or most people try to feel heard. And one thing that kept coming up was the care work doesn't just involve caring for family, but it involves caring for country, it involves caring for your community, it involves caring for your culture. And as Jasmine was saying earlier, that holistic approach is not seen by the current systems that we have always been battling against since the beginning of time, or since the beginning of colonization. And so what we've been seeing across our work when engaging with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women is that they often feel unheard and unseen because of these systems. And I really don't want to focus on the deficit, because our work is really focused on taking strengths-based approaches and shining the light. But unfortunately, with some parts of the care work that came out of the the Caring About Care report highlighted a lot of the gaps that's shown. I'm just going to quickly look at some of the notes that we had taken from the care work. Particularly, there was one, and I hate using numbers because I think stories and stories of women captures a lot more, but to give people perspective on what that looks like against non-Indigenous populations, it's First Nations women spend about 14.8 hours per day on care-related activities and balancing multiple roles with their families and communities compared to non-Indigenous women and communities. And I'll give a personal experience and personal example. Like last year, I spent a lot of time caring for both of my parents, particularly my dad who was unwell, and then my mum who was unwell and going surgery. And there was just a lot of things to juggling the responsibilities of these two things that are happening at home, to juggling full-time work, to juggling being away from home and family business happening at home. So there's a lot that we deal with on the daily that's happens beyond 9 to 5. And when we think about care work, and I think Jasmine, like you were speaking about it beautifully, how it comes from personal experience to now your professional work. But even then, sis, I know that it's beyond the window of just your work hours. It's your sense of being and knowing and what you know and what you provide to your community. So when we've engaged with women over these last couple of years, those are the things that we have heard time and time again, to feel seen, to be appreciated, to be heard. And as I mentioned earlier, the Wiyani Whangani project spent the last 7 years listening, and now it's in the response phase. And the Caring About Care, and even this panel alone, it's about how do we action some of the things that we've heard to make these women feel seen, to shift systems and take a holistic approach rather than this generic Western approach that hasn't been working for a very long time, to see positive impacts in our communities.
Yeah. Absolutely. And look, very inspiring work. And I think your lived experience also highlights, I think, some of the challenges. You know, when you live and breathe it, you know, it's more than just translating data and you know, stuff that you come up with out of your research. Now, I just wanted to reflect on how challenging systems are to navigate as a First Nations person alone. But as Jasmine highlighted, the carer responsibilities, and I guess the holistic view of carer responsibilities, is that it is not just about the support I provide to another person. It is about our connection to country and how country takes care of us. You know, this holistic view around well-being. And I always reference the social and emotional well-being model. Love it, live it, breathe it, taught it for many years. Very passionate about that. And look, Zoe, you and I had a chat last week about some of this stuff. I might just turn to you and to draw on the work that Banok's been doing. A question that I have is, what kinds of changes are the First Nations carers that you've worked with? What are they looking for, and what is important to them?
Yeah, thank you so much, Judith, and thank you so much to the other speakers as well. It's so awesome to hear all of these different perspectives and the consistencies across the work as well. Certainly in terms of a strengths-based approach and elevating the voices and stories of First Nations women. To answer your question though, Judith, yeah, we had a really good chat about the social emotional wellbeing kind of framework and model. It's such an important framework, definitely, and it does reflect what came through in the Caring About Care report as well, about the crucial importance of what you talked about, Banok, and Jasmine, you talked about it as well. Tricia, you mentioned it as well. That reciprocal nature of, or the broader nature of what caring means to First Nations women, as opposed to how caring is often defined in kind of like mainstream Western white, you know, and feminist literatures, which is very, very specific. Even at the outset of this webinar, we heard that caring was kind of defined as just caring for a family member or a friend, but yeah, something that came through in our discussions with women was consistently that caring for people and community can't be separated from caring for culture, caring for country. You know, caring for family, kin, community is a cultural responsibility in and of itself. And, you know, as you said, Judith, caring for country is part of that, and country also cares for you in return, right? So this is a much broader definition of care that I think that policymakers and and others need to take seriously, because it's often not reflected in policy making. And so to your question though, Judith, a bit more specifically, what were women in our study really looking for? They wanted to make sure that the whole policy landscape recognised that care is broad, right? And that often policies, particularly in remote communities, but not only, will set up barriers to caregiving, or unintentional, maybe unintentional, but maybe just not thought through in terms of a gender lens and a care lens. One example was remote, employment programs and social policies that have activity like mutual obligation activities and things like that attached to them that require people to do stuff that gets in the way of care, right? Just to get a kind of what is often a measly social security income, that also gets in and of itself in the way of caregiving, because it reduces people's incomes incredibly. And then the economic burden of that care can be huge as well. So what we did hear from caregivers that we spoke to, and I should say we spoke to about 102 women across 5 urban and regional and remote different locations across Australia. So we went to the East Kimberley, Cape York, Greater Sydney, the ACT and Central Australia and around Alice, and remote communities around Alice. And one thing that really came through was there needs to be like a holistic view in terms of the kind of greater care infrastructure, and that care needs to be at the centre of policy making, regardless of whether that policy making is specifically in the health space, specifically in commodified care services like childcare and things like that, social policy, but there needs to be a connection around this kind of centre point of care, and that's crucial for women going forward. So I hope, does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it absolutely does. I think we're getting a real strong theme here of hearing the voices of the people that you've been working closely with. And I'm mindful of time. I'm going to keep moving along, but thank you so much, Zoe. I know there's more that we can expand on, but given we are constricted with time, we'll move on. Jasmine, I wanted to turn to you. So we had a really good yarn, and you highlighted some very strong views on how we can do things better. So this question that I want to ask you is, how can we better enable First Nations voices and prioritise, I guess, the priorities to make sure that we inform care-related policy and practice? One of the themes that came from the Caring About Care video was really emphasising, self-determination. We had a good yarn about that. But what are your thoughts around, how we can enable First Nations voices again and their priorities to inform policy?
Yeah, no worries. Thank you again. So I did really enjoy the yarn we had, and I did mention in that yarn that being a First Nations female, a First Nations person in this country, I have an association with almost every negative statistic you can think of. If it's not me that's personally experienced it, it's a member of my family or my husband's family has. And that's the reality of who we are as First Nations people. I firmly believe, and this is part of why I'm going through my own journey at the moment of being involved in research, but also going through higher education and training. I firmly believe that for things to have a positive impact for our people, we need to have our own people in positions of power that can amend, update, transform and change policies that do benefit our people, because we know what it feels like to live in the life of a First Nations person. We know what it feels like to have to navigate and through discriminatory policies, historical mistrust of government agencies. We live that. So in order to have that information and that greater understanding passed on to non-First Nations health professionals and providers, we have to also be able to come to the table and sit at that table and have that conversation, so that we have the evidence base that we need, that, yes, I have the lived experience, but I also have the qualifications and the education that expects you to sit and listen respectfully to what I have to say. I firmly believe that being able to provide better pathways for First Nations health professionals and academics to be able to be involved in research and policy reform and change is one of the only ways that we can have a better impact and improve health outcomes for our people. And that's part of the journey that we're all on. I firmly believe that we continue to learn until the day that we take our last breath. And I want to be able to be a part of that journey, because at the end of the day, it's not about individual recognition, that spotlight being on you for what you're doing. It's about the legacy that you leave behind for the next generation, for future generations. I myself have a personal experience of caring for others through post-suicide support, of losing family members to suicide, to having children that have special needs, ASD, ODD, ADHD. You know, we've even written poetry about I'm More Than an Acronym, because it's about putting really honest and powerful wording so that people have an understanding that we need to get to an even balanced place so that we can even begin to close gaps. And it's basically as simple as it gets.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's, I think, very, very powerful words. And I'm just seeing some of the chat that's coming up there. Someone has said very powerful words. Thank you, sis, Jasmine. So the reality of the challenges that we live in, you know, as marginalised people, as sovereign people of this country, yet we still have very dominant Western, you know, leadership hierarchy models. And one thing that it gets me thinking about, and Jasmine, we shared this quote the other day, is talking about nothing about us without us. You know, because this position of power imbalance is really kind of driving, I guess, the delay in terms of progressing where we need to be around policy and practice. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I think are really important to highlight the how we empower people, and Aboriginal and First Nations mob sitting at the table, being the people that are our leading conversations, are decision makers, and making sure that we are genuinely and meaningfully designing policy and practice on the ground, as people with lived experience and people that understand it, and a different kind of investment to the work as well. You know, we're all emotionally attuned and invested in this topic. We know what's best for our mob. So definitely First Nations mob leading the way and experts in what we do. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to move over to Tricia. With all of your work, and I guess summing up the comments from all of the other panelists, what do you think are the opportunities to improve self-determination in carer support design and delivery?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's worth starting with perhaps those yarns and then expanding out to a system perspective. So in every moment, there's an opportunity to have a yarn that's informed by that holistic perspective, that is active listening, that is listening to the story, and knowing and understanding the importance of both the style of communication and connection. And that we mentioned, you know, connection to kinship, connection to country, to language, to culture, in all of the ways in which it's important. So from an individual perspective, we have people sitting in different settings wanting to have family there, have communication with family, have Wi-Fi access, have telephone access, telephones brought to them, have transport support, and have accommodation that allows them to have safe communication, safe moments with family. So some really basic sort of one-on-one, but also then moving outward into linking with elders and linking with knowledge holders, linking people, peer support, ensuring that the health workers are supported and employed and available, and then moving into more of the services, what's available, peer support, so that people are able to hear from others with their own stories. And then it's about great partnerships between whichever services are involved, so that especially we have community-driven priorities that shape those services, and that needs to then be within a policy context, a system context that is focused on quality improvement and recognises that cultural safety is what quality is about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that, Tricia. And I might just go over to Zoe, if you don't mind, just to expand on that. You and I had really rich conversation about what self-determination looks like around carers really driving systems change and designing and delivery of the support of, I guess, the system of what they need. Just handing that question over to you, what are some of your reflections on how we can further, I think, not looking at it from improving self-determination, but really driving self-determination and authentic and meaningful self-determination?
Yeah, thanks, Judith. I mean, what Jasmine said. But then in addition to that, you know, there are so many policy, you know, the kind of like path dependent ways of doing things in policy making that are really problematic and that go against or run against empowering and supporting self-determination and self-determining policy making by First Nations women and all First Nations carers. You know, I'm thinking, I just wrote down 3 kind of points here as the other speakers were chatting. But, you know, one of them I think that always comes up is if there are opportunities for supporting care services, even care for the carers themselves, which is something we haven't touched on yet. But, you know, carers need care, they need respite, they need support themselves. Then wherever it's possible to do so, those services should be delivered by Aboriginal controlled, community controlled organisations, right? It should be the absolute like basic rule. And yet we still see that not happening. We still see big kind of multinational conglomerates moving into remote communities in particular and providing those services. And often they're not culturally appropriate, they're not culturally safe. And it goes against a community's own self-determining kind of approach. The other thing I wrote was slow down. Like the policy-making process is often so bloody fast because it's responsive or responding to political cycles and, you know, what's on the issue agenda this week. And for actual proper consultation and self-determination to take place in terms of developing policies that support caregivers and that reflect the needs, the genuine needs of First Nations caregivers, that needs to be a slow and deliberative process. You know, you need to take time to, as the other speakers have said, like sit and listen and have those really long yarns, you know. And I think the other thing in particular, thinking about remote communities, is that we've seen, you know, like this big shift to kind of digital consultation methods with government as well. And whilst that can be helpful in some respects, it's really difficult often particularly for remote communities where you've got, you know, really crappy internet access, internet dropping out 4 or 5 times a day. Like it's just not a way to consult in an inclusive manner. So be cognizant of the fact that that's not consultation. And what isn't also consultation is just speaking to like a couple of people in a community. You know, you need to actually get into a community and really understand who the knowledge holders are and the diverse perspectives of communities as well. So go slow, fund archos, and, you know, do more than just digital is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely, Zoe. And look, I think just a few words that I really wanted to expand on in what is taking time and slowing down. And you did talk about, you know, policies being a rush process and it's kind of in response to something. And I kind of try to distinguish between, is it responsive or is it reactive in reaction to something? And a lot of the times it is in reaction. And I think one thing I wanted to just highlight in our yarn today is a conversation that Jasmine and I had earlier on around the challenges that we face with this idea of consultation and meaningful consultation, but also the idea of co-design. Co-design has been a buzzword for, you know, a long time, a couple of decades, I'd say. And in all of my experience in all of the work settings that I've had, and I've got a very, you know, expansive, I guess, broad background in terms of the work that I've done, is that it really is people coming forth with preconceived ideas and real, ideas around what self-determination looks like for First Nations people is coming with a blank slate and getting people from the get-go with the first ideas on paper is letting them tell us. And so I think that's really one thing. A true self-determination is Aboriginal people from the get-go leading the conversation and shaping what policy looks like. So thank you for that. That's some really kind of rich takings that we can take away from this conversation. Binoc, I wanted to ask you, particularly, I know that your background is around policy, and transforming policy and writing policy. So this question is really around, what is the specific strategies and policy changes that are needed to improve, recognise and include First Nations carers?
I'm going to answer that very broadly because I always think that what needs to change is systems. We need systems change. Every year there's about 15, 20 reports or strategies that are put out by government agencies, and it's exhausting. Like the fancy word is co-design, but then there's also, Zoe, you were talking about it earlier, consultation. And our communities have been over-consulted for many, many years. What more do people need to know? Because if you're publishing these reports, strategies every year, it's the same thing over and over again. Sorry, just 1 second. I just need water.
Well, you fix your throat there. I know we all get frogs in the throat, but I just wanted to, I guess, touch on that very point around consultation. We have been some of the most researched people in the world. A lot of our reports and inquiries, and there's lots of recommendations from inquiries over many years, and we know a lot of that hasn't been implemented. And so there's a massive gap in terms of, I guess, finding information and translating that into practice. And I think it's a constant battle. But in the meantime, with the consultation stuff, I think, Binoc, what you're getting to as well is how much more do we consult with community and take, because the other thing that I'm really mindful of is when we're consulting with community, how much of your bucket of funding in terms of shaping policy or programs is considering intellectual cultural, Indigenous cultural intellectual property, because it's something that we don't talk about as much. But look, I'll hand it back over to you just to finish off on that question about policy design and what changes need to happen.
Yeah, changes with the system, but I think the issue is there's trying to figure out the best way to say this, but when it comes to thinking of sovereignty and data, particularly the Indigenous data, there's a sensitive conversation around amongst government agencies and government bodies that they're almost threatened by what that means for them, not for us. So it's not just shifting their thinking, because everybody's got their own ability and power to make the decision to shift the way that they think. But there's that notion of, oh, what does this mean for us? Is it going to be a threat to our agency and our work and our data? But not really thinking about what it's going to do for the communities. And so if like you said, Judith, like there's been all these inquiries, all these reports, all these recommendations for over 30 years now, and not much has been done, but it's the same issues that keep coming up, and they invest all this funding and money into things that have already been done. But if they take a moment to listen, shift the way that they think, and actually think, okay, maybe the issue is with our policies and systems, then maybe then we will see something that's actually changing, because it's time and time again, everything has been so deficit, from closing the gap and its targets, so deficit compared to, and what are they measuring against? Or like I said, all these reports and recommendations. Like I remember a couple of years ago, we were reflecting on the last 30 years of the recommendations from the deaths in custody. And like back then it was like, I think 472, this was like a couple of years ago, 472 people that have passed to now it's like over 600, and it's like growing every single day. And yeah, the issue is, do people want to make the decision to listen and not feel threatened by the communities, but actually listen and give that care to the changes that they want to see?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think there's some really important notes that I just wanted to reflect on there, Banok, as well. I mean, when we talk about when, people are given the opportunity to have access to data, and I'm talking about our mob, data sovereignty, what that looks like. And expanding on what you said, Zoe, around the importance of engaging Aboriginal community control organisations. Now, we know, I mean, my experience in Closing the Gap, I was leading the implementation plan for a period of time for South Australia, so I'm very well versed in terms of priority reforms, but particularly the first one. Priority Reform 1 is about shared decision-making and partnership. And, I think we are still a long way down the track from getting it right, because we've got all of this background in research reports, investigations, inquiries, and we know evidence is there, but it hasn't been acted upon. And it is about shifting that power and balance. However, we know living in a very dominant system, it is a real challenge. But I think in terms of people who are linked in today, think about this conversation and enabling First Nations voices. The start is getting people at the front of the wheel, taking the wheel, having the conversation and leading from the get-go around what policies and programs look like in terms of closing gaps. I think one of the big things we can emphasise is really investing in trying to reach the targets for the socioeconomic targets in the Closing the Gap, and particularly Priority Reform 2 around how governments can invest in Aboriginal community control organisations, because we know our mob leading the way, having the data to be able to make local decision-making processes for communities is a really important message that we can all think about from there. Now, we are almost out of time for questions, but Zoe, I might ask you this one here. How do you think we can better share and promote the findings of the First Nations carer research that you've been involved in and what others have spoken about?
Yeah, thank you. Look, I think panels like this are a good start. I think listening to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women who are leading this amazing research is a really good start. So it's fantastic to have those people here today. Look, I think I couldn't agree more with what Banok was saying about consultation versus actually bloody listening, right? And so I think, it comes down to, yes, of course, we can make sure that there are strategies to kind of promote this sort of research and elevate the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander carers, to make sure that they're made visible in policy making. But ultimately, it does come down to the listening side of things, So the work isn't on the side of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, again, as it usually is, right? To try and get people to listen. Actually, the work is on the side of the listeners to actually really pay attention and hear what's being said. And as Banok was saying, and as you were saying as well, Judith, that's often not the case, even though we've got so much data that shows us what should be happening, it's often not the case, which is a tragedy. I think the other thing I would say as well is, and very, very briefly, on the ACCHO's point, ACCHO's also, it was something that came through, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, is that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community controlled orgs are also much safer places for the women that we spoke to work, right? So there's a lot of, cultural load, of course, like that in other workplaces, but actually part of working in those workplaces, in those ACCHOs as well, is feeling more cared for. And so that's a really important aspect of making sure that we're prioritizing funding towards ACCHOs as well. But I'm going to shut up because I'm going on for too long. But thanks, Judith.
No, that's all right. And look, I think this is a really important point to end on, is how do we increase better access for care needs for mob? in rural and remote communities? How do we engage them? How do we provide supports around them? And I might put this question to Jasmine, if you wanted to talk to this one here. So the question is really how, with I guess everyone's experience on screen here, how will this work inform practice for rural, remote and very remote communities?
Thank you for that one, Judith, and thank you, ladies. You've all spoken beautifully and so powerfully today. A really easy way that I wanted to show about how we can make sort of these things a reality is I'm actually wearing one of the resources that's come from our research project. And we created a positive affirmation tee for carers that the ladies had something to do with. So the image that you actually see on the front of my tee is actually the logo for our Wisdom, Our Ways research qualitative study. It was a piece of artwork that I completed about our women and always looking to the stars, looking to our creator for guidance. And on the back of this t-shirt, I won't turn around, it actually has some positive affirmations on there as well. So it's an acronym of I am a carer. And I'd just like to, if I could, just read that out really quickly. And it's words can be powerful. There is a power in being vulnerable. And the I am a carer stands for important, adaptable, motivated, accepting, compassionate, aware, responsive, empathetic, and respected. So that was a really simple way that we came up with something for our women to be able to immediately identify a similarity that our women, the participants of this study, actually, we created these t-shirts for the women. And when they see another woman wearing these shirts downtown or walking in the street, they automatically go, I know that you know that I know. And that's all it takes.
Yeah.
The objective of our study was to also create clinical and non-clinical resources that we could provide not only to health professionals, but to NGOs, to ACOs, to ACHOs that could go out, and we created a booklet that is basically titled Who Cares for the Carer? But this booklet goes out, and what I love about it is it's designed by our people. It has our Wiradjuri language in it as well. And one of my favorite sayings is actually came into this booklet without even knowledge that I didn't have knowledge it was going in, and I actually have it tattooed on my arm. And that phrase is Murrin Wiganya, which means breathe, just live.
Wow.
And as First Nations females, that's all we can do on a daily basis is we breathe, we live, we get up and we do it again.
Yeah.
And if we can create resources for these carers that are in clinical and non-clinical spaces, it creates improved well-being. It impacts in a positive way on these carers because they feel seen, they feel heard. And without carers, there aren't people to care for. And we need to concentrate more on the people that are caring for these individuals that are utilising so many services and health supports providers that we don't ever ask the question to the carer, how are you coping in your role? That's a very basic question that needs to be asked at every single interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. Look,
I could go on all day, so you'll have to shut me up. So.
Yeah, no, look, I just wanted to highlight that someone actually wants to purchase the t-shirt. So I think someone might want to reach out to you soon to find out. But such inspiring work and real authentic design and engagement with carers. I love the acronym. It fits beautifully. And I think just to expand on, I guess trying to increase what things look like for regional, rural and remote and very remote communities. Zoe, I might just give you a minute or so just to reflect on the conversation that we had about trying to make things more accessible, how we consult with community and making sure that I guess reflecting on my own experience and knowledge in this space for First Nations people, the more remote we are, the more worse health outcomes we have, the less access to resources. And, fly in, fly outs are usually the way to go to get support. But what ideas do you have around if we could transform policy and practice and emphasise where the most vulnerable are supported in really remote communities? What are some of the ideas that you have for our listeners today?
Thanks, Judith. And Jasmine, those t-shirts are so cool. That's really beautiful. That's a lovely way of creating that network of support and that sort of I see you, you know. In terms of remote communities, I mean, it's a big question. I think that though the answer is again probably simple, right? I mean, it's actually empowering remote communities to assert what their own needs are. We're not empowering them, actually just recognizing their sovereignty to do so, right? But in terms of what that looks like practically for the women that we spoke to, you know, like you said, Judith, health and wellbeing services are just so inaccessible in remote communities in particular, but even in, you know, in urban landscapes as well. A lot of the women that we spoke to were saying, yeah, okay, well, there are plenty of health and other services here, but they're not culturally safe, you know. So it's like also mapping, you know, the availability of services in terms of cultural safety, which circles back to our question of ACCHOs as well, right? We keep going back to that. But one of the kind of powerful stories that one of the women up the Cape told me was, you know, just the lack of services in terms of childcare even as well in one of the remote communities there, where a locally delivered childcare service was drastically underfunded, opened at 9 o'clock in the morning. So she would drop her child there with other children in the community, but then and go to work, right? And then have to go back and pick her kid up at 12, actually her kids up at 12 noon on her lunch hour. Because the community childcare centre closed at that point, and it became essentially from there in a childcare desert, where, you know, there was no service available. So making sure that that funding is there for basic, you know, needs for people who are looking for care, and that basic care infrastructures that are often taken for granted in non-remote communities should be there as a baseline, right? It's just not, there's no excuse for it in a country like Australia where we've got the financial resources to do this, and it still doesn't happen. Well, you know, like this is not just poor policy making. This gets down to, this is racism at the end of the day. Yeah.
And so I guess in terms of reflecting on all of those points and really important, you know, contributions there from you, Zoe, one thing that a lot of people know me at a national level is that I've loved narrative therapy and teaching the narrative approach for many years, as well as social and emotional wellbeing. But one thing we always talk about, and I guess expanding on what everyone has said, is focusing on strengths rather than deficits, but also looking at an assets-based service delivery where we are acknowledging the skills and contributions of the richness of knowledge in community and actually drawing on their knowledge and expertise. And I think going back to Jasmine's point around how we are upskilling and providing opportunities for education for mob on community to be able to lead some of these initiatives is a start, I think, and something that is some food for thought, I guess, in terms of how we're making things really accessible and capturing the voices of community. Now, that's kind of the end of our set questions, and I just wanted to draw on a couple of things that have come through the Q&A poll. So firstly, thank you to the ladies, but there's more. So there is a question here to you, Zoe. It says that you mentioned mutual obligation being a barrier to caring responsibility. Would you please be able to expand on it? And does it also create other barriers for First Nations carers or exclude them to access supports? So my apology if this question is not articulated well.
Oh, no, that was very well articulated to whoever articulated that question. And thank you for the question. So I'm really kind of referring to, I mean, I'm sure that many people on the webinar would be aware of kind of requirements in Social Security to, you know, in order to get access to things like unemployment benefits, so job seeker payments, even carers payments. Until just recently, we've seen that it's not activity tested now, which is a nice change, but a lot of payments are activity tested. And so particularly, I mean, a lot of my work has been in remote communities and looking at the slightly different policy landscape there. But in a lot of cases, what this means is that people's time is taken up like having to do things like apply for jobs that aren't there or aren't going to be appropriate. A lot of people's time is taken up having to go physically to employment service providers when there might not be any bloody jobs in the community, right? Like available. So there's structural unemployment, and making people churn through these sorts of activities just to say in policy that they're busy is actually getting in the way and taking away time and energy from people's ability to provide care, to receive care, to access the services that are available. And so, I mean, I've long strongly advocated for a removal altogether of those sorts of activity obligations and or the pursuit of alternatives. One of the lead author on this Caring About Care report, Elise Klein, with other colleagues, has advocated for something akin to a participation income, right, where unpaid care work is the activity, you know, and you receive an income based on that. You know, like it's just the constant having to prove that people are productive when, you know, in a system that doesn't make their incredible reproductive labor visible, you know, is just bonkers, and it's harming people. So we need to change that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for answering that one, Zoe, and thank you for the question. That was Joe from the Mosaic Multicultural. I can't see what the rest is there. And look, there's another question here, and look, I think we all touched on it. The importance of acknowledging sovereignty. And, you know, I guess accepting and acknowledging sovereignty is really the thing that we're looking at here. But the question that is, and this is kind of an open question, then I might get Banok to maybe answer this one. Do you think there's a predisposition / prism around the notions of sovereignty and that being seen as different? Our question around, in general, what does it mean? And how can that be reflected in practice?
Yeah, I spoke to this briefly earlier. So I'll give a bit of a background to my answer. So Judith, like before I was at the Institute, I worked at the Productivity Commission for 15 months, just working on Closing the Gap review. And there was a question on priority reform and calling it and asking, why do we have to, there was these conversations at the table saying, why does it have to be called Indigenous data sovereignty? Nobody's mentioned sovereignty. And then there was discussion talking about, well, sovereignty might be a word that people might be threatened by, there might be sensitivities. And I'm not talking about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities that would be threatened by it, obviously not, but other people would be threatened by the word sovereignty. And I guess to answer the question by Melissa, I think the notions of sovereignty and the predisposition of the sovereignty is mainly people that don't have an understanding of what it actually is and what it actually means for us in our communities, and even amongst our own communities. It's amongst our own definition of what we see is sovereign to our nations. But how it can be reflected in practice, that's a question I don't know how to answer, because I always say whilst we know what it looks like for our own communities, what it would look like in practice, but for the discussions that I've seen at the table, there are a lot of people that are threatened by it, but it's not a threat at all. If they actually sit down and listen, which has been a theme of this panel, and they understand what it means for communities and the impact that it's going to have on communities and our people, then that's when you'll see rippling effects of the positive outcomes of what listening actually means. So I don't know if I've answered your question the best way that I can, but it is really down to the individual and whether or not they want to understand what sovereignty means to our nations.
Yeah, I think it can be seen as like a bit of a misunderstanding or misconception, should I say, around the word sovereignty, because essentially when we talk about Indigenous data sovereignty and Priority Reform 4, it's about giving our peak organisations that are leading Closing the Gap initiatives to have access to local data that primarily affects their lives. And so they are actually given information to make local decision making and progress around program design and development. So that's that component, but not working in a productivity commission and knowing CTG back at like the back of your hand as well. Very complicated and still lots of misunderstandings around what that looks like. But Jasmine, just wondering, strong First Nations woman, any thoughts around sovereignty that you wanted to contribute to finalise our conversation?
I think you've both answered it perfectly. I think it does come down to individual understanding of especially Indigenous intellectual property. I am a firm believer that our knowledge is sacred. So when we make a conscious choice, and it is a choice, to share that knowledge and to transfer and translate that knowledge through the generations and to others, that there needs to be an understanding and recognition and acknowledgement that that data comes from the world's oldest living, surviving civilization in the world. And that is because of our oral history. So we need to recognize and acknowledge that. And even if it makes people feel a little bit uncomfortable, we wouldn't be a country, a system of who we are today without our First Nations people. Yeah. There needs to be basic recognition and acknowledgement for that. And I think that when we are using the knowledge, especially of our elders, that there needs to be that recognition and acknowledgement that that data is sacred and that data belongs to our people first and foremost. And when we choose to pass on that data, that should be a privilege and an honour for the person that it's being passed to. And it should be handled with respect and, we say, proper way. Everything should be done proper way. And when we talk about proper way, we talk about protocol, our cultural protocol, our cultural obligations to our heritage and our legacy, to keep those stories sacred, to keep that knowledge sacred, and to pass that knowledge on to better benefit and impact positively our people and future generations.
Well, ending on that note, I'm just in awe of all of you. I just want to thank you for your time and thank you to everyone that's linked in today. I feel really transformed by this conversation, and it's given me so much to take away and reflect on in terms of systems change and really trying to make sure that First Nations voices are leading the way in every aspect that affects us. So nothing without us, nothing about us without us is the quote that I'll always stick to. Now, Nubujigal is the word, lateral love all the way. Making sure that any carers that are linking in, make sure you reach out. There's been lots of questions that unfortunately we couldn't get to, but we've taken them on notice. We will have all the information, the slides and the video and other resources uploaded to share with you all. And this recording is actually live and people can actually watch that back. Now, that's it for me. I just want to thank the panel again. Each and every one of you are phenomenal, inspiring women that just are experts in your field. And I just want to acknowledge, that it has been an absolutely delightful opportunity to be here. Thank you for dobbing me in, boss, to be in this one. But look, thank you again. I'm going to hand you back to Sarah just to do a bit of a summary and to wind up for now. So thank you all for having me.
Thanks so much, Judith, and everyone, and particularly to our guest speakers as well, Trisha and Barnock, Jasmine and Zoe, not just for your time and insights today, but I know it's been a long prep journey and we've had many great conversations. And as you can see from the chat, everyone today is really, really thankful for the time that you've spent to share. And I can see already that people are really listening and taking on board some of the points you've shared. So it's a tough act to follow. I'm just going to do some real kind of, I guess, housekeeping wrap up. But I guess just to kind of reflect from my perspective as someone working in carer policy, at a time when so much policy reform is happening in the carer support space and other associated sectors, including a renewed focus on First Nations engagement, it's so important to hear directly from First Nations carers about the recognition and support that they need and what that looks like. And look, there were so many great insights in this discussion. I was madly taking notes the whole time. I'm glad it's recorded. We will be poring over this to kind of really distill it and continue the conversation. But some things that particularly stood out to me from the conversation was that a holistic view of care that is inclusive of care for culture, country and community is essential if we're going to adequately recognise, support and empower First Nations carers, and that sometimes that narrower Western mainstream definition of caring and how social policies are designed around that can actually create barriers to caring. That's a really important point that I think you don't often hear in these platforms. And I also thought that what came out really strongly was that for policy people in the room, particularly, it's really important to slow down that policy making process and to properly listen, to take time to sit and listen, not to focus too much on digital consultation methods, and also not to come with predetermined conclusions, but to really have a blank slate. And I thought it was really a great reflection as well, which spoke to something I said right at the beginning, which was that First Nations communities have been discussing and resolving problems like this for thousands of years. And I think really kind of following that example and actually tapping into that wisdom is so important in this space. Then also striking the balance between genuine listening and over consultation. And I think there was some really interesting discussion around the nuances of that. And I really liked the point that the work should be on the side of the listeners to pay attention, not on those sharing their experiences. And Jasmine's comments as well, the t-shirt obviously was a great hit, but I think really highlighted that it's also important not to just go ahead and implement things, but actually to feed back to the people that are involved and are sharing, and to show them that they've been heard and seen, and actually translate that research into concrete supportive initiatives that's actually designed for them as well. And so before we look, I could say so many more things, but I just think it's all been said, and just some wonderful insights from our contributors today. So before we formally wrap up the session, we just want to pause and capture you before you all go off to lunch and just get your feedback. So another poll of 2 questions are going to pop up on your screen. And if you could just take a moment to just respond to those very quick questions before you leave, that would be great. And also, we've already seen so many of you put in the chat your thoughts and reflections and how you want to kind of implement what you've heard today. If you haven't done that yet, or you have additional thoughts, we'd really love, and I'm sure our speakers would love, to just hear from you what stood out to you. What will that look like for you in your own life or work, putting that into practice. So please do feel free to sort of have a bit of a think and write some reflections there in the chat once you've responded to the polls. And that's going to help us really with writing up the results of this and sharing them. And I thought Jasmine made some really great comments towards the end around knowledge being sacred, and when the choice is made to share that knowledge, whether it's data, wisdom, it really needs to be properly recognised and acknowledged and respected, even if it makes us feel uncomfortable. And that's something that we really wanted to prioritise in this webinar, is making sure it's not just a set and forget conversation, but that we actually work with our contributors to basically share these insights as broadly as we can and really implement them into the work that Carers New South Wales is doing in the policy and research space, but also to share them all with you. So we will be meeting again soon with our contributors. They've given us a lot of their time, which we really appreciate. And we're going to summarise what's come out of today, led by them, so that we can really give that back to all of you, and that can be passed on to transform policy and practice. So that's our plan next. And given that you've registered for the webinar, you will receive that information. You'll also receive the recording of the session for those that asked about the recording. But just to kind of formally wrap up today, I also wanted to mention some other Care and Knowledge Exchange activities that may be of interest. The Care and Knowledge Exchange Research Library is a growing searchable collection of carer-related research that includes a whole sub-theme focused on First Nations carer research. You can be welcome to browse that. We're going to put a link in the chat. And also, please add your work. If you've got work that should be included there, you can do that through the website, or you can email us to work out how to do that. And some people had asked about staying connected. You're also very welcome to subscribe for the project email updates, which I believe there'll also be a link put in the chat. And that's where you'll hear more regularly about other opportunities in this project to contribute evidence, to discuss evidence, to learn from evidence. So we encourage you to do that. And finally as well, and I think we're going to throw up a slide at this point, if I can get Lucas to do that. We just want to acknowledge again that many of you today are probably, like our speakers, joining with lived experience as a carer, some from First Nations communities. So if anything today has sparked concern and you need additional support, you can find a range of trustworthy contact information on the slide. That was also posted in the chat earlier. We're really conscious that it can take a heavy toll thinking and sharing and hearing about these things when you've lived them. So just make sure you take care for yourself and take a break if you need to reflect after the webinar. But other than that, look, we really just wanted to, again, thank everybody that's been involved, especially Judith and our guest speakers. I'm sure you'll agree that they just they have so much wisdom, and it was just an amazing learning experience listening to them, but also to the team that helped deliver this webinar, and to everyone that joined today. We had a record number of registrations for this webinar, and we really appreciate your interest in the subject, and we really appreciate all your contributions through the chat. Some really great Q&A as well, which we'll make sure we pass on to the speakers if they haven't been addressed. And yeah, we invite you to continue to collaborate with us and connect with us to transform carer policy and practice. So thank you, everybody, and we will wrap up there.